Hello everyone, welcome back to an all-new Process Mining Café. Our topic today is strategy and execution, and often we see that there's quite a divide between these two worlds. There's people who are really working on the strategy level, defining strategies for the organization, finding ways to implement them, and then there's people who are executing, who for example, perform the process mining analysis. And often these are not the same people, and there's quite a gap between them. And so to discuss approaches about how we can bridge this gap, specifically in the context of process mining, I'm here today with our very own Rudi Nix. Welcome, Rudi.
Hi, everyone.
And we also have a guest, and our guest today is Bogdan Ciungu, who's a business expert manager at JTI. Hi, Bogdan.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We are very happy to have you as a guest because, in fact, you're the perfect guest for this Process Mining Café, for this particular topic, because as a business expert manager, you're sitting comfortably, I would say, between these two worlds. So can you maybe introduce yourself a little bit and explain how you sit between these two worlds?
I think comfortably is a bit optimistic way of saying it. But yes, I'm taking this position since over a year now here in JTI. I've been working in many other positions before, but I'm now fortunate enough to sit and watch both sides of the fence, which practically on one side is a blessing because I do understand exactly which are the pain points and which are the needs of my colleagues, and having this satellite view also enables me to formulate a more educated judgment on whatever the problem is and come up with a better solution than otherwise looking at just the tiny little pieces. And on the other hand, it's not exactly always a blessing because I also need to be very careful not to become the bottleneck in the process. It's very easy when you have multiple projects flowing around you in a matrix-like type of a setup where everybody needs a piece of you every day. So in a nutshell, I'm fortunate enough to work in this, we call it BTS, AI, Business Technology Solutions Department, where I overlook both the strategy and the implementation part of a program that we call in JTI Intelligent Automation. And more than happy to share the experience and the journey and the future steps on it today if we have the time for this.
Perfect. That's exactly the perspective and the view that we need for this discussion here today. So thanks very much for making the time to join us here.
More than welcome.
Now, before we start, I just want to point all of you watching, welcome, thanks for joining. And what you can do also is you can participate. So just below this video on this website, you can see a chat window where you can just type in your name and then you've entered the chat, which is open while we are live on air. And during that time, you can send us any comments or remarks or questions that come to mind, and we will keep an eye on the chat, and we'll try to pick up those items in the discussion where we can. All right, so let's get started now. So like we mentioned, there's a divide between strategy and execution, but also if we're looking at the different, at the process mining world, what I wanted to start with is just by bringing up an overview again about the landscape. So I brought a few slides here that we're trying to share right now. Where at the beginning of this year's Process Mining Camp, actually, I was sharing these slides because we were looking at all the Process Mining Camp presentations from the past 10 years, and we saw that they are coming from very different industries, right? Process mining can be applied in many different industries. So here, for example, we see finance, logistics, government, healthcare, and so on and so forth. But besides looking at industries which people often do, they try to find, for example, examples or learn from people who are trying to do the same in their industry, maybe at a similar company. But another way to look at that we think is crucial to the discussion of process mining use cases is which is crucial to understanding the benefit that process mining has, is to look at the use cases, and you can identify different use cases based on what are people trying to do with their process mining analysis. And you see use cases like customer journeys here and IT use cases. So there's process improvement teams, right? In a simpler way, we can have this simple picture here that illustrates a little bit like some of the most common roles that people have who are working with process mining. And as you can imagine, someone, for example, who's an auditor has a very different purpose and goals when they apply process mining compared to someone who's part of a process improvement team or a process manager. So what we see is that where people are coming from also has an influence on how they adopt process mining, whether they see it as a new or added capability, for example, right? So really that was something that we discussed before. So can you maybe talk a little bit more about what we see there?
Yeah. So of course we talk a lot with people who are starting with process mining, and we see that from different type of use cases, but also from different type of organizations, you can look at the introduction of process mining, and they are doing it slightly different. So sometimes I get this question: is there one kind of cookbook how to implement or deploy process mining? And from my experience, actually there isn't. So it depends a little bit on the angle and how you want to use it in your particular use case. So for example, is it something new you want to introduce, or do you see it more as an added capability? So to give you an example, if you, for example, look at it from an auditing point of view, then you have this auditor. And this auditor is using different kind of tools or techniques in order to support his auditing work. So in order to support their auditing work, they need different type of tools. So not only process mining, but process mining could be one relevant tool that can be used to answer a particular type of questions as part of one particular type of audit. And so in this particular way, you add process mining as a capability of the auditor in order to support his work or his particular audit. And so in that particular way, it's not impacting the whole strategy, but it just is something that needs to be added and learned as part of a capability of something that you already are doing. Well, if you are looking at the other spectrum, so sometimes we see that you have a program where they started to do cost saving or a digitalization program where processes need to be automated. So it's very big and impacting multiple processes or projects. So then they started to use something new in order to discover this potential or value that can be harvested in order to deploy these digital processes. So then process mining is kind of part of the whole strategy in order to automate these processes or implement processes that are more efficient compared to the existing processes. So what we see that there is kind of a top-down strategy, so going from a strategy perspective, creating value. But we, in a lot of cases, also see a bottom-up approach, where one individual is starting with a process mining initiative. They start with a technology perspective, so they need data, they need a tool in order to support it, but then need to develop the capability, so going up, and then delivering value eventually, and maybe if you want to make it bigger, as kind of an oil spill, there is a great presentation from Nationale Nederlanden who present how to do this change process or develop this kind of oil spill. But then you need to make it bigger and then tie it to kind of a strategic value of it. But there's also the other way around, where you first define the strategic value, estimate the benefits, and then start to implement or use a tool. And so then you need to go from the top-down perspective. And maybe that's a question to Bogdan. So how did you approach it, and what was your first step?
Well, like you said, Rudi, there's hardly a cookbook to walk you through the process, and the wise saying says learn from everybody else's mistakes, not from yours preferably. So this is what we tried. But before getting there, I think it's important to mention that in the beginning we didn't even know we needed process mining. I must make a parenthesis. JTI started a journey of digital transformation several years ago, and as part of it, this program evolved. And when we first started with intelligent automation, we began with RPA, in fact, with robotic process automation, which is quite an interesting field. I'm not going to go into details because I don't think it's necessarily relevant, but I'm happy to take questions on that later on, offline, on LinkedIn or whatever. It was a program that began as I would say, natural evolution of our organization, because we all look for efficiencies, like you mentioned, and we wanted to get the best out of the technologies existing. So I started scouting that, and then the next question was, okay, what do we automate? And then we said, okay, processes, fine, but which processes? How do they look like? And this is where the discussion kind of got to a halt. And we said, yeah, but we have our BPMLs, we have our definition of the processes. Yeah, but this is not exactly how they're being run. I know for a fact that in this particular factory, there's a few variations because of ta-da, ta-da. On this other location, we do it differently because of ta-da, ta-da. And then pretty soon we realized that there is a base process, but there's a lot of things happening below the radar that people only have a rough idea about, but you can't really touch it. And furthermore, there were new systems introduced in JTI that didn't even have the process mapped at that time. And then another challenge emerged, which is, well, I learned later on the terminology. And the process discovery part was also another great usage of process mining as a tool. So very soon I realized that it wasn't just the robots I needed, but also a process mining tool, and preferably have it deployed before the robotics as a scouting tool, if you want, for the processes we wanted to automate, deploy the robotics, then redeploy the process mining and see whether the improvements that were estimated in the beginning by the introduction of the RPA would have been achieved. That was the strategy. As you mentioned, there's always a gap between what we want to get and what we can get. So on the strategy parts, at least on paper, things looked all right. But then it came to the actual implementation. So, of course, we never had such a tool before in JTI. We never even knew where to start and everything. So I think that the natural way this evolved was, okay, let's start an RFI, which in JTA terms is request for information. So it's not exactly a bidding. It's more like, can you guys explain us how your tools work, what the advantages would be, high level, the prices and all that. And this is how we met, by the way. And I'm happy we took that step. And yeah, we got very far. Yes.
Maybe let me jump in there, because that's a great point that you're making, that you, in a way, right, Rudi was talking about this bottom-up and top-down approach, and for you it was actually even different. So you were taking this top-down evaluation approach, but in a different or neighboring area, and then you found out you actually need processes and came across process mining, but then you want to do an RFI, and that's a little bit like, maybe more coming from the strategy perspective or from the top-down approach, where you do have to define what you're looking for, right? Even when you're making an RFI, which is request for information, you have to somehow specify what exactly you want to gather information on, and you have to define some parameters. So this is a little bit like, speaking of the divide that we started with at the beginning, right? The people who are on the strategy side or thinking about strategy, people who are executing, performing actual process mining. What we see on the strategy side, or people who are coming from this top-down angle, is often that they don't have a very good overview yet what process mining can do, what is even feasible, what are realistic goals, or also maybe what the use cases for their particular organization are, because there are so many different use cases for process mining that you can pursue, right? So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, and often, so that's one of the topics that we also wanted to discuss here today, is like, when do you start an RFI if you're taking this top-down approach? How do you do this? And for example, what I often recommend to people is that before they actually start these kind of formal selection processes, is that they also gather some information themselves, maybe by even taking 2 or 3 different tools, maybe an open source tool, a monitoring tool, a standalone tool like Disco, and analyze some of their own processes to get a sense of what their use cases are and what is important for them, to then, in this kind of strategic top-down selection, be more clear about what they want. So I'm curious how you did that.
In our case, it was kind of a mix of everything. Like you mentioned, it totally made a difference to understand that this domain, which was rather unknown for us back at that time, was not exactly unknown for some of our colleagues in IT working in other companies. So one great source of information, at least for me, was to discuss with these people and see how do they use the tool, what were the pitfalls, what should we keep an eye on, what would be potentially the business benefits, because, there's always an efficiency target coming from upstairs for which everybody strives to get there. But there's always additional benefits, not always tangible, that people might not be aware of. And when you talk to different sales teams, of course, they will present the product in the best way they can. They will share their past experiences from their other clients, whatever they see, whatever they hear. But I think the best you would get by talking to the people on the field and checking with them and seeing exactly how it worked. And this is what we did. So besides discussing with various vendors on the market, on the product and everything else, we also discussed with, like I said, colleagues in IT who already implemented it. One of the things that came from the top-down analysis was along the lines of Kaizen. We're a Japanese company, so we have this continuous improvement thing in our DNA. So somehow it was natural to see with every technology that we bring in JTI, the question being raised, what's in it for us? What are the benefits it's going to bring, besides, of course, solving the business solution we have purchased it for. In the case of process mining, the what's in it for me question was relatively simple to reply. First of all, it helped with the company strategy of having a visual decision-making system. Process mining ultimately is not just about digging into data, but also representing it in a way that you can later on slice and dice and formulate opinions and business decisions ultimately. So it came as a great tool exactly in a period in which we were discussing about other tools of building dashboards such as Power BI or SAC from SAP or whatever. So it came, I think it's hard to sell a process mining tool knowing that sometimes it might come with a cost, but if you put it in the broader perspective, that should definitely help selling it. It's people should see it as a start point, I think, of every journey.
Yeah, exactly. And you did in the process of learning about the technique, you did apply it also to some of your own processes, right? Did you do this with IT? Is this?
Oh yes, that was the starting point actually.
Oh yeah, exactly. You brought an example of that. So maybe,
maybe we can have a look at that.
Should we show that maybe?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So you brought an example of an incident management process. That's what it is.
Exactly. Yes. So we have the incident management process being run with the ServiceNow platform inside JTI, and we have this. Well, I'm using ServiceNow terminology now. Configuration items. There's pretty much every business application has one of these configuration items. So one day I got the question, okay, we have this set of applications which is maintained by more or less the same people. We would like to have a look at what's happening with the incidents and whether there is any bottleneck and what can we do to sort it out. Now, from my point of view, I think process mining is great in identifying the pain points, showing you where things don't really look right. I'm not sure that with just the picture I exported, one could also answer, okay, what next? What do I do? This really requires somebody who understands the process, who understands what's happening in that picture, and then to formulate the what's next steps.
That's a very good point. We will come back to that in more detail also. Yeah.
Yes. So coming back to this particular picture, if you scroll to the, thank you. We have the global support desk, which is pretty much most of the cases the entry point for many.
Is that at the top here?
Yeah, the GSD thing.
Okay.
Yes. Naturally, I have kind of obfuscated a bit the names of the teams. I don't want to give too many details, but roughly this is how it works. So practically it starts from there, and then it goes from team to team until the case resolution. There's a lot of outsourcing teams involved. Because it's like I said, it's a complex system composed of several components. Every outsourcing team deals with something. We have internal programmers as well, and then there is a group that ultimately declares the case closed, and that's pretty much it. Of course, we have some external partners in the process, including Orange, as you can see in the picture. And then here you can clearly see the path, the path the incidents usually take. And the normal support model would say, okay, it starts at GSD level, the ticket goes to the key support team. It might or might not involve the programmers. It might or might not involve some other outsourcing groups, but always it goes to the last outsourcing team, which deals with it and closes the case. That's the usual path. But then if you scroll up to all the other paths the incident is going, you will pretty quickly discover that it's not always like that. As a matter of fact, we have quite a few other teams involved in the process. And for us, it was a bit of a shock, like, wow, what are these people doing here? Why are they being summoned? In some cases, it was a wrong incident reassignment, because you can actually isolate the cases and have a look at exactly what's happening there. So that was the situation with some of them. Some others, we discovered that were kind of creating a bottleneck. Maybe we can go to the animation part and show it.
Yeah. So the bottleneck was one of the places, that was one of the goals of the analysis,
exactly.
right? Looking where
the primary goal, actually. Yes. So we tried to understand what slows down the whole process, and we quickly discovered that after a certain while, there is this communication path between the key support team and then the last outsourcing team. And focus on that zone, please. Which was already overloaded with cases, and furthermore, the team, the last outsourcing team, was having troubles understanding what's happening. So you will see some incidents bouncing back at the support team, asking for details, of course. Which sometimes is normal, but then you start asking, okay, why haven't these people been provided with information up front? So that was a whole set of questions that was addressed to the process expert to sort out. You can also raise a question about sizing of the outsourcing team. These people are getting 100 incidents a month. Is 2-3 people enough? Maybe we should increase the team. Then you start looking at the incidents themselves. What nature do they have? Are they always Q&A kind of questions? If they're Q&A, why do they go on this avenue? Why they're not replied directly by the support desk, for instance? Let's write some knowledge base articles and send them to these people, so that in case you have FAQs repeating over and over again, they could just simply reply and then offload a bit this communication channel. So as you can see, it's seeing the picture and understanding the process kind of helps you also formulate like, so maybe we can improve this in this way, maybe we can improve this in this way. And this was the baseline, if I can call it so. I'm actually curious that after we deploy some of the ideas that were formulated in the discussion, if we rerun the same exercise, how would the picture look like? Hopefully more clear.
Yeah. Oh, that's, I think, a great example. Yeah. Rudi?
Yeah. So I was wondering, right? So you started the whole journey for process mining with this digitalization program and RPA maybe as a basis to automate these processes, and then you found process mining, so probably still relating this on the strategic level in the deployment or the implementation of that program to automate these processes, and then took the step in order to do the execution, right? So this is very much the execution. So then there is a whole gap, right? You experience between the way how you thought and positioned it within the program. So that's kind of the first question. So how did you go about it? But also, what's the major contribution of doing it yourself in the execution that helped you to make the positioning? And then did it change your view on process mining or your initial view?
Oh, it totally did. So let me start answering in the reverse order. You raised the questions. To be fair, when I started it, 1.5 years ago, I had no idea process mining existing. So I didn't know what it is, what it was useful for, what tools exist on the market. Nothing. And then it was a bit of a very steep learning curve. When we started the RFI, I think we invited like 10 companies probably to demonstrate the capabilities and everything else. And I was taking notes during the calls like, so this is how they do this is how they do that. And then I compiled a report and pushed it upwards to my senior management. Like, guys, look, we have this thing. It can help you here, it can help you here, it can do that, it can do this. Efforts are minimal. It just requires somebody who understands the data structure to provide that data, and someone else to look at the picture which is compiled by these tools. You don't have to draw anything, the tool does it. Okay, it's not always like everybody markets it. It's not always that simple, but that was the principle. And then discussions continued. One of the things, for instance, which emerged recently was related to Internet of Things, which probably some of the people here in the call might already benefit from. There is tons of data these little devices produce. There is tons of data coming from sensors on machineries, from you name it. There's just a lot of information, and humanly, it's impossible to just dig into that and try to make some sense out of it. So an additional advantage for me would be, for instance, to plug in the process mining tools and into a production line sensors array and try to trace the product from point A, where it starts on the production line, to point Z when it goes to the warehouse. Or probably, if possible, track it further. And try to look in the whole process, again, bottlenecks, volumes, influence of preventive maintenance, of not doing preventive maintenance, all these kind of things. It's for me, it's like I said, I'm in a very fortunate position that I can not just make recommendations, but also see how they're being done, how they help, and fine-tune the next steps.
Yeah, I think that's such a good example of how there's so many different opportunities, right, to apply, to work with data and to do process mining. And that's also why we see there's so many different ways to use process mining. And if you're using it for a different use case or for a different process, you will need different things. So while we are talking about RFIs, I also wanted to ask Rudi again, because we do see that that companies approach this differently, right? So do we have any tips that we could give to someone who is thinking about making an RFI, for example, how they can ensure that they actually ask the right question? Is there anything that you would tell them?
Yeah. So of course, so if you are looking for a process mining tool, then what we have seen is that there are different type of use cases for it. And from my experience is you cannot combine everything. So not every type of use case is looking for the same functionality. Yeah? So an RFI in most cases, so Bogdan, correct me if I'm wrong, they are looking for functionality of a particular tool. So they are not written on a particular use case level yet, or focused on one particular use case level. But you already mentioned there's a broad scope of being able to apply process mining within an organization, and trying to capture all the functionality or define what process mining is. So if you look at the whole spectrum or scope of the different type of process mining tools, they have different type of angles. So it can be very broad in a sense, try to describe it with the functionality which is there. So from my perspective it's to bring it into practice and then see what you actually need. And also make it a little bit smaller, right? So if you look at the RFI, you can try to commit to something for a very long time and say we are doing this for already 10 years. But in 10 years, a lot of things can change, right? So if you're doing something new, so deploy something new or add something to what you already are doing, you can also look at it from a perspective that you would say, okay, so what do we need right now in order to take the first steps, for example? Bring it into practice, learn, and then adapt to it as you go. So don't try to implement something that is there as a final solution, because there's never a final solution.
Indeed, I think You just mentioned something which really popped into my mind. Sorry to interrupt you, just quickly. I remember there was a discussion about process mining to be run in a certain process inside our global business service centers. And immediately I got the reaction, why do you want to do process mining on this? We're changing it anyway. And then my next question was, okay, you're changing it into what and based on what? We know it's rubbish. We have to fine-tune some things. Okay, based on what? Again, that was the question. Nobody answered. So I think it's people should also understand that process mining is not just something you run once and forget about it just because you want to get a radiography of things. I think people should understand process mining as a continuous loop inside the organization. The typical plan, do, check, act, which doesn't come from, I think it's PMI terminology, if I'm not mistaken, PMP, sorry. So deploy the process mining, get the results, take an action, and then redeploy the process mining against the same thing and see where you got with whatever actions you have decided. Maybe they're good, maybe they're bad. Depends on the process length as well. Don't run process mining every 2 days if your process produces results in 6 months or later.
Yeah, it really depends.
It's many things that have, you were asking me what were the criteria when we started the RFI. There were some of them, but the criteria evolved every day with the discussions we had with the people when we realized the potential of the technology. And it's not just us. Imagine the power of having a process mining tool embedded inside your ERP and basically slapping your hands whenever you try to do something which you shouldn't be doing, which would then later on question even the existence of an internal audit department, for instance. That's your internal audit, ultimately.
Yeah, that's one of the use cases, right? And that's, I think, the little bit the chicken and egg problem that we talked about before. Like when you're defining those kind of, what are you looking for? What are the strategies or the parameters that you want to learn more about? Yeah, you already need an understanding of the use cases, and there's so many different ways to use this. I think that's one of the challenges.
Yeah, and also the other challenge is also, it depends on the approach, right? So if you approach it from the top down and you have this kind of ambition where you have the opportunity to save, for example, a lot of money or reduce a risk, for example, and it needs to be done quickly, and then there could be a very good business case for it, right? To just try to implement it and roll it out. But of course, in the execution, you need to make a lot of decisions, where to start and how to realize these actual benefits. And often they are talking about end-to-end processes. So they assume that they can stitch all the data in the organization already together, while we know that there are some requirements needed in order to get there. And so also on the execution, on the strategy level, it can be a great business case. But of course, it has to tie to the execution level to be able to see the end-to-end process. And so you need to get ready in order to get there. And so sometimes it needs a lot of data work or preparation work to get there. And that's also kind of the mismatch what I sometimes see if people try to approach it from the top down, is that they have this ambition of predicting processes, right? So it's easy to say, we want to predict the process. We don't want to look back and see the historical replay of the process. No, we want to predict it. But if there is no basis to predict it, then that's a great ambition, but it's very difficult to execute. Yeah. And so that's also to be realistic on that level of, of course it's good to have kind of a dot on the horizon where you want to go. But from my perspective, it's also important to take a good step and to be realistic of what would be a good step. So, for example, work on the data aspect of it.
That's a good example for realisticness, I think, because if you want to predict something, first the process needs to be stable enough, right, to be able to make meaningful predictions. And that's something, that maybe people have overly optimistic expectations or don't really know what's realistic or not. But the other thing is also what we have been talking about with the use cases, like who's doing what, right? So it's not just about, for example, the functionality or the features of a process mining tool, but to find out who in the organization is doing the process mining analysis, when, how does it fit into the current way of working? there needs to be someone who does this, right? It's not something that gets done automatically, and someone needs to do something with those insights also. So all of this needs to be worked out, and it's very hard to work out what that is if you don't have an understanding yet of what process mining is and how that works.
Indeed, and besides the academic aspects of it, I think my recommendation would be for somebody who starts from basically scratch, try to have somebody who sees both the strategic and the implementation part. The reason is simple. Like you mentioned, Anne, somebody might want to run an analysis on a process that doesn't actually leave any trail, any digital trail at all. And then how would you do it? So it happened to us, like, for instance, we wanted to have a look at something that was being run in 2 or 3 systems in parallel. One of them didn't have this audit log. So we could piggyback on and, fill in the dots. So the question is, what do you do next? Do you wait another 6 months for an audit log to be built and then collecting events and then rerun the analysis? Do you apply for task mining maybe? If that's another approach which is available, I see it as on a rising trend lately. Maybe it's not too bad. People are still concerned a bit about this privacy aspects. It all depends on how you configure the task mining tool, of course.
Or you can collect manually some data for a time. It's possible, right?
Just sit there 6 months behind an expert executing it and taking notes every day. Depends very much. Of course, I'm an engineer and I'm an IT guy, so obviously I would rather make use of the tools where I can.
Yeah. But you're emphasizing the bridge, the necessity again to bridge the gap, and I think that's very much true. And so far we have been talking a little bit more about this kind of top-down scenario where someone is, for example, constructing an RFI, and how can they know enough to be able to do that in a meaningful way. But I think the opposite side of the coin is also really interesting and important, and that's also something that we wanted to make sure we talk about here today, is where we have the opposite situation, that someone maybe comes into contact with technology and they want to apply it, and they're maybe fascinated by the technique, but they miss this link to what's the benefit for the organization, right? Really, that's kind of the second perspective, like where the strategy is missing. So the execution side is,
Yeah, so one particular example where we see this, for example, is from IT perspective. So from my IT perspective, as someone who has heard of process mining, they started to use it. Maybe they start to apply it on one of the processes. And then maybe also already finding something interesting. But of course, need to make and bridge the gap with the business. So somehow you need to make a link with the business and with their strategy or their problems in order to be able to make it stick. Otherwise, it's just a one-off. And so it's interesting. What would your advice be, Bogdan?
I think
if someone takes that approach.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, don't underestimate the complexity of a process mining problem. It takes a lot of stakeholders' alignment before you can even start. I have seen the trends, and not just in our organization, many other organizations as well. People usually come to you with a solution instead of asking, what can you do for this problem? They say, okay, here is process mining, I want it. Okay, hold on. Let's have a look at the what. What do you need? What do you try to get by running a process mining? Is it really making sense to look at it? Do we have the right resources? Is it a good timing? You can't really run a process mining in isolation from everything else that happens in a company. Like I said, maybe sometimes you have to export that data from a system which is still being under construction or expanded or anything in that direction. So, like I said, there's many stakeholders that will have to be brought at a round table. It definitely helps to have somebody who really understands what process mining is about, and I mean from the theoretical aspect, but also from the tool perspective. Of course, in the happy situation where you do have a tool. If you don't have a tool, then prepare yourself for a bidding, and it's not going to be an easy one. In our case, for instance, I would definitely recommend, at least on IT, make sure you bring on board pretty much everybody from all your departments, whether it's security, whether it's network. Imagine it's huge amounts of data which are being fed into this application. You don't want that to become a bottleneck on a certain network node, for instance, or to create performance problems on your ERP just because you extract 200 terabytes of information out of it over the night. So think of everything it can impact from technical perspective, but also think of everything it can impact from business perspective. And the fun part is that it's not just IT who requires analysis on the processes, it's also the business who always wants to look back, see what they did wrong, or maybe not necessarily what you do wrong in an organization. Maybe there's external factors, like for instance, we ran this P2P analysis last year, and in the procurement flow, we could clearly identify there were several vendors that constantly delayed delivering or produced delays in the whole purchase order process, simply because they sent, for instance, invoices with line items mismatched from what was initially agreed on the PO. Yeah, and then you can clearly see how it does impact the overall cost of running that particular process in an organization. Of course, you need somebody who understands the process. So if you put a nice picture on screen or a nice animation, okay, you can wow people with it.
I think it's both. It's you need to have someone who knows the process, but then you also need to, and that's even, I think, a separate dimension. You need to be able to make the link to what the benefit is. So that's basically making the link to the strategy level, bridging that gap from the bottom to the top, if you will, to know like what are the goals of the organization? How can we improve this process, right? Even if you know the process and you have a picture and you know what everything means, that doesn't necessarily help yet to translate this like in some kind of benefit, right? And Rudi, this is something we sometimes see with people who are enthusiastic, who get started, but then if they are not able to make that next step, then they, in a way, they get stuck, right? And they can't really get anywhere. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So what we see in practice is if you look at the process mining analysis, you get a lot of detailed view about the process, right? So you can see these bottlenecks, you can see places where you deviate, for example. So that can be very concrete things you have found in the process mining analysis. However, that doesn't directly tie into the whole strategy of the organization, or maybe for that particular process. And so what you want to achieve with this particular process. And so if you see a bottleneck, for example, it doesn't say that bottleneck is actually a bottleneck. It would be a bottleneck if you don't deliver in time. And so in that particular way, it should be somehow tied to what they want to achieve with this process. And of course, there are a couple of situations. And so you have this situation where they don't know or they don't have any agreements yet, so they don't have any SLAs in the process. So then you still have to have the discussion of what is the status quo. The process mining analysis itself can be really helpful to have that discussion. Should it take 2 days? Should it take 3 days? We see that on average it takes 3 days. Is this enough? In some cases we see that it takes 30 days. So what's kind of the maximum, what it can take? So the process mining analysis can help to set that discussion. But if there is already something like an agreement, then it should tie into something about the output of the process.
I think the process mining should actually be handled as mini projects inside an organization, because it's not just about sitting and dissecting the resulting picture for a day or two. There's also tons of preparation work for that. I saw it quite often, like for instance, we want to trace a certain thing end to end, but we discovered that part of the information lies inside the ERP. Part of the information sits in some satellite of the ERP. Another part of the information, we don't even know where it is. So simply analyzing where do you get the data, that takes some time. That's an additional stakeholder, the guys that do understand those systems, the source of your information. They have to be brought on board. And then there is also the problem of accessing the information, which personally I hit against a number of times. There's certain information which is considered confidential to some degree in every organization. Like for instance, you might run to have a look at HR, but HR information is not exactly exposed to everybody. Or you might want to get access to financial information, but you only have access to entity A and B, and the rest is invisible for you. So all these complications should be like put somewhere in some sort of a lessons learned log, so that the next time you do a similar exercise, piggyback on the existing experience, and be prepared for it. I mean, it's not just let's do it tomorrow.
Please.
So if I understand correctly, so there are a couple of boulders, right? So it's not only the boulder where you want to tie it to the business perspective and then tie it to the business value, but also values such as the data privacy and data security issues, which can arise during such a process mining analysis. So how to deal with it and find solutions for these type of problems, or how to organize the data and where should we position it, right? Should it be part of a centralized data extraction persisting model, or should it be decentralized, or should it be something different?
Right, exactly. Now, specifically for this aspect of tying it to the business value, though, right, which is then kind of the last part of the project, which we see people sometimes struggle with if they're coming more from this execution side and are not used to making the link to business value or to the strategic goals in the organization. So that's an important piece that they're often missing. And so what we wanted to do also here today is to try to show a simple example, right, really how you could make this link, because often it doesn't have to be very complicated. You have to simplify, you have to find approximations for how to measure something that can be related to some kind of desirable outcome. So maybe it's a good point in time. Should we go through this very simple example that we prepared for this?
Yeah, perfect.
So can you see my screen here?
I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, so what kind of process is this?
Yeah, so this is a reimbursement process. So imagine that you have traveled from A to B with a train, for example, and you want to reimburse that train ticket. Then you have to go to the HR reimbursement process to get your money back. And so this is the HR reimbursement process. You can see that some of the activities are dark blue, which are more frequent, and some of the activities are light gray, which is kind of more exceptional behavior. And if we want to look at the process flow, then we can change here to the case frequency, and then we can see that there's actually a flow going through this process. But the actual process is much easier. So it's very simple in the sense that if I want to do a reimbursement, then I need to submit my ticket in an online reimbursement system, upload this ticket, and then it will be checked by the HR department. And if it's approved, then it will be processed automatically and being paid out. So using the process mining analysis, we can extract data from this HR system. And so it is the case ID times an activity, of course, and then visualize this process. And this process is on the workflow level, and so we can see all these activities. And it also helps us to visualize already where we can see the pain points of this particular process. And so if we look at the performance, then we can see where there are delays. And if we zoom in, then we can see that this is the place. These are the places where we can see interaction with the human resource. And so either the manager that needs to be approve the ticket, or the HR employee that needs to check the form.
Right. I just want to point out as an interjection, this is a place where many process miners find themselves, right? When they start learning about the topic, starting with an analysis, they see a picture of the process, they see measurements and bottlenecks about the process. But now, how can they now make the next step, right? So if you're analyzing this process, how can you make the next step to actually focusing on the business value?
Yeah, of course. And that starts with the question, right? So we can see a bottleneck, and you can confront people saying, we can see a bottleneck here, and have a discussion of the root cause of this bottleneck. But this is not the business value that's being created. So the business value always starts top down. So it starts with the question, what's important for this particular process? And then the manager would say something like, it's the most important part is not how quickly we process these tickets, but how much time is being spent internally in order to process these tickets, because then it's kind of depending on how much cost is being involved in this particular process. So this process is all about a cost driver. And so as a next step, if we look at this process, then we want to focus on these activities that actually take time. So if we look at this process, a lot of these activities which are kind of grayed out are automated activities. And so are activities that don't take any resources per se. And so you can argue, is this interesting for this particular cost driver question? And it actually isn't. And so we need to simplify this particular process map and then focus on this perspective. And so we can add a filter here to focus on all of the activities that actually are performed by a person. And so there is a process step in there, which maps out which activities are automatic. So the empty activities are assigned to an automated machine. So a machine is doing the work.
Automated workflow steps, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't cost anything in a sense other than processing power. And if we now create a visualization of the process of these steps, which are done either by the manager in this case or by the HR employee, then we get this perspective of the process. Now we can see everything. And so we can see that it starts with submitting the form, SDP generic main workflow. Then it goes to checking the form by the HR employee. And then it's process automatically being paid out. So put in the status that it's being paid out. And in some cases, it requires an approval of the manager. So it's the gray activity 190, which you can see there. But this still doesn't answer the question, how much does it cost, right? So if we ask this question to the cost center manager of the HR department, then he would say, yeah, my resources are in the check form or in processing this manually. So I'm actually looking at these two activities, check form and process the form manually. So each of these steps will take considerable time from my resources. So we again can focus on these two activities.
Yeah, for the HR department specifically, right? If they want to save money. So which one should we just keep? Just the
so that's the control request step.
Yeah.
So that's
and the handle manually.
Employee and the handle manually. So that's also done by this particular person.
So these are the manual HR activities only.
Exactly. Yeah, and then we get a very simple process map, right? So the process map is kind of telling us now how many times a particular step is being done. And if we look at the performance view, you can see what we have here. And so we only had one timestamp, so the activity itself is considered to be instant, but of course it takes time. It takes on average 18 days if we have a first check and then a second check, and then there's 8.9 days in between the manual processing of it when it drops out. So we don't have the time of this check form. So the first question was, how much time does it take? We don't have this time because it's not in our data. So if we had a starting timestamp and a completion timestamp of each individual step, then we would have a total time spent on these activities, but we actually don't have it. And so there's still a gap between the goal which we have in this type of analysis and the process mining analysis which we have here. And in order to bridge the gap with this strategy, we need to link it up. And so if we look at the frequency, what we have is the number of times these steps are performed. And so if we look at the absolute frequency, so the number of times the check form step happens, it's 2862. And so 2862 times this step is being performed. But on which time frame? And so if we want to have a calculation, then we need to make a calculation based upon a time frame, for example, for a month or for a year. And so if we apply a filter, then we can trim it down and then look at the time frame for one month.
Yeah, because now the data set is going a little bit longer than 1 month. So if we want to use kind of a baseline, right? So that's why.
Oh, yeah. So if we look at the time frame, then we can see that it runs from the 1st of August.
Yeah, 1st of August and the 1st of September.
Until the 1st of September. So that's not exactly 1 month. So if we want to make some calculations, of course, then 1 month would be a good indication.
And we would set it to trim, right? Because we're trimming out all the events in this.
Yeah, so we want to take into consideration all the activities that are performed within a month. So we are not looking at the whole process, which are completed within a month, but all the activities that are done in a month.
Yeah, I think it's quite something that people should be also ready for. And this is the beauty of having a process mining tool, because you can slice and dice into the data in real time. It's not just a static picture that somebody would put in a PowerPoint on a big screen and say, okay, this is how things are. Because the moment questions are starting, your tool expert has to step in and be able to perform all this filtering. Ideally, you should bring additional dimensions, not just the basic event-related stuff, but maybe you have certain things that you want to correlate with the data you put on screen, and then you can do multiple filters on that, or jump from one topic to another, or from one perspective to another. It's for me, it's like a Swiss Army knife.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
but even,
it is, and that also creates the complexity, right? So,
true.
If you look at everything, then it can be very overwhelming, and especially if you are not the expert on the process itself or the domain expert, but still very good with doing these type of process mining analysis. Yeah, then it's kind of the question, where do we look at, right? So first question is, what do we see? But if you make an interpretation, what is kind of important? So this is eventually actually a process is being executed. There are real people performing these checks, right? So so if you are the manager of this department, you are struggling with certain things, and that's sometimes very difficult to create that bridge, right? So what's their struggle? And then having this picture to make their struggle really a visual, tie what you see in the visualization to the things that are important.
And what is nice about this example is that there might be still gaps, right? Like here, for example, we don't have 2 timestamps. It's actually quite a few data sets that you get with process mining. Some do have start and complete timestamp. That's great. But if you don't have that, doesn't mean you can't do these types of analysis. You have to find other ways, right? So here, for example, we would be able to work with an estimate, right? Really, we would ask, for example, a subject matter expert or the process manager, like, how long does it take this manual activity for the HR employee? And maybe they say 15 minutes, for example, is what it takes, right? So we have to work with that estimate. And how would we, let's also show how can we actually take this now and make this link to an actual business value that we could put in a business case, for example.
So of course this is a real example. So what they did here is take the number of steps, and so we can see the number of steps here at 2790. These are the number of steps. So we are looking at the absolute frequency, actually counting the steps, even if there's rework. And then based upon this, if they have an estimate of having each step 15 minutes, for example, then that's kind of a quarter. So say 2800, and then a quarter of that, 700 hours.
So let's
and then we can make a calculation out of this. So we have 700 hours spent on this activity for 1 month. And so if we want to have an hourly rate, for example, of 60 euros, probably on the low side, but let's take that, and then have it for 12 months. And so do a business case for a full year. Then we see that the total cost center for this particular activity is 500,000 euros in this particular example. And then, of course, we need to think about scenarios. So process mining, it doesn't solve your problem here. So it makes apparent what the investment is in this particular process. And then as a next step, of course, we can think about the scenario. So for example, we introduce a sample check for which we only check half of these cases in order to reduce the risk. And so,
and the rest is automated, for example, right?
And the rest we will not check anymore. So there will be a sample checked at the front, and the rest is kind of skipped. So the risk is being reduced to check part of it. So then we can make the calculation for this particular scenario, and then multiply it by 0.5, and then have this as a yearly benefit. So 250,000 euros as a yearly benefit for this particular scenario. In this example, actually, they were able to reduce it to 80%. So then we can again make a change in this calculation, and then see what the cost saving would be for this particular example. So in this way, you have this very detailed process mining analysis, but there are ways to bring it back to the managerial or more strategic or value level, to have a broader cost driver that can be brought into the strategic perspective in order to make that investment, in order to do these type of analysis and improvements, and make it more tangible. So, for example, if this was a case where you would implement RPA, and then it would be easier to decide whether or not the investment is worthwhile to do the RPA project, and if you didn't do this exercise before, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is a very simple example, if you will, but also really concrete and a real one. And often you try to find these approximations in real life. So that's what we see. And we want to encourage the people who are on this kind of strategy execution side divide, who are coming more from the execution side and have maybe are struggling a little bit to make this connection to the business value, to the strategic perspective, to really take an effort to make that step, because only then they can also ensure that their process mining activities are actually contributing, and also that they can get make an impact inside the organization and get people on board and basically get, for example, resources internally to continue doing this. And so we wanted to show you this simple example, and we also will share together with all the pointers and resources that we share with the recording. We also wanted to share kind of a template that we have made. It's kind of a business case template for process mining, because in a business case you're always looking at the cost benefit, cost and the benefits side, right? And the cost is usually relatively easy. You can look at how much do the licenses cost, the training, how much time do people need to invest. Sometimes you have to pay to get your own data. You have to buy it back from some kind of external organization and things like that. But then on the benefit side, there's also different kind of ways, right? So the example we just showed really was kind of a cost-saving example, and that's of course one dimension. You can look at benefits like saving costs, and here we have some just collected examples from different areas, and we have put them specifically also for the reason that we mentioned at the beginning into these different roles. So you see the first column tells us like from which perspective, from which use case are we looking at process mining here? Is it the process excellence group? Is it the auditing? Is it the IT department, right? So there's different kind of drivers and different kind of ways how you can use process mining and benefit from them. For example, here in a cost-saving dimension, and then also increasing the revenue is another dimension. For example, we have seen like with how you say Wohnungscoöperatie, Rudi, how do you say this in English?
The housing
association,
housing corporation association.
Yeah, housing. Yeah. Right. So there was a process where they could also automate a part of the process where, and we will share the link with the show notes also, where when an apartment is left by the current tenant, that they offer this same apartment to a new tenant, but in the time between the old and the new tenant moving in, the apartment is empty and they don't get any rent, right? The housing association doesn't get any rent in this time period. So here also the business case is actually very easy, because you can pull by reducing the time and by automating kind of parts of this process to speed it up, they will actually not save money, but they will get more money. And also the third dimension, kind of the soft benefits, are also really important. It's often not so clear to how to tie process mining specifically to cost savings or to added revenue, but sometimes it's more soft, right? So that's also something I wanted to talk with you about. What do you see how people can deal with that side? So Bogdan, was that also a value for your organization, for example?
Yes, indeed. And actually I wanted to paint on the picture you just brought in discussion. Sometimes RPA is not necessarily the solution to the problem you see on screen with the things being slowed down. In one of our processes, we discovered that actually raising a bit the threshold from which an approval is required expedited the whole execution greatly. So you may think of the solution in terms of cost, of FTE saving, of whatever, but also you may want to re-engineer a bit the process itself. That can also bring additional benefits. So from my perspective, I think to have the complete business case, it's not just about the savings, it's also the potentials of growth and sustainability of the process you work on. And I'll give you a concrete example. Whenever we run an analysis and we come with a solution, okay, that solution would probably address specifically that problem. But then you need to think in perspective. Okay, I deploy this thing, what next? And continue asking this what next and the why questions until there's no more why and what next questions to be raised at that time. And then you can say, okay, I fine-tuned that process to the point of it's the best I can do for the moment. No worries, in 1 year we'll come back and we'll have some more what next, because organizations never really stay
right. Yes.
The same. Sometimes they change even in 6 months. But I would say have this in view. Try to come back at your decisions 1 year later, remeasure, and see what else can you do. There's always a what else.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. And so I know that you started it top down, bottom up, but then came back top down again. And then often you need to find somebody who owns the whole implementation or the whole execution of that part of the program, or maybe even just the tool. So, and the question is, if you bring this kind of under a governance, right? So if you are in between the IT and the business department, how do you govern the execution itself? So you could have a good idea of what you want to achieve, and maybe you already see these other opportunities as well. But how do you go about with the governance of the execution itself? So how did you do that?
Well, it's kind of hard to sell a recipe of success. So I can only tell you what we did in our organization. It worked for us. Hope it works for others as well. In terms of governance, our core business is obviously not IT and not running process mining. We need process mining, but it's not something we work on. So I think the first challenge was to decide where do we put it. And there's only two options, IT or business side. We choose IT just because it's an IT investment in the whole program. It's a lot of technologies involved, so we pay from our portfolio. I did discuss with other colleagues of mine where the decision was taken in favor of the business to sponsor the whole thing.
So if you would say, where do we put it, then you mean who pays the bill, right?
Who's the owner? Yeah, who pays the bill, ultimately.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one way of seeing the thing. Second way is the capability. When you put it on the left side or on the right side, always think, okay, do I have the right people in the team to sustain the program? Do they need something else? And ultimately, you will end up with a mix, because you can't really put it in IT and just have the IT people there. You always need the business experts. You can't really put it on the business side and not give them access to the data simply because they're not IT. Yeah, you need to open connections to SQL databases or God knows what else. They won't be able to do it by themselves. Yeah. So in our case, it's a mix. It's a mix because we didn't find a way to really make it work just on IT or just on the business.
Yeah, interesting.
There's always the dimension of the prioritization of the work to be done, which also has to be considered when you have a small nucleus of people that can do process mining in a big organization and you have tens of projects coming in the queue. You obviously have to prioritize them somehow. So it's not just about getting the tool and getting the expertise, but also understanding what has to come quicker in terms of results. And I'll step back to the moment in time when I said treat it as a project. So consider that every process mining requires some preparations ahead of time, and take that time into consideration as well. There might be a high priority project that when it enters the implementation pipeline, you may end up the process mining exercise 6 months later. You already may lose some opportunities of doing things on other process mining requests that were sitting in the queue in the meantime. So it's not always that simple.
Yeah, It's an interesting point that you made. I just want to highlight that because I think that's something that for me it wasn't that much like at the forefront of my thinking, because I think it's clear when you're going top down that you have to choose like you were discussing before, who pays the bill, right? So who's responsible for it, and that also has implications on maybe where resources get trained, but also basically the responsibility, but also the power of deciding what do we do next. If we want to do more, then we actually have the capability right now. So that's also part of the ownership and the responsibility that you have.
Indeed. And then there is also about this demand management, how to prepare the demand. People don't really know what to expect. I mean, like I said, either they come with the solution. I need process mining on, I don't know, order to cash process. Okay. High level, yes, we kind of know where to start, but in details, when you start asking the question, okay, what do you want to see? What are the questions we should be replying at the end of this mini project? Then you discover that you might need additional information from the master data to bring I don't know what, from the billing system to bring I don't know what. And then pretty soon you will start drawing the map of all your stakeholders that have to be involved. That will also help position the project in time, because these stakeholders might have other priorities at that time. They might not be available to help you at that time. You have to consider this. Yeah. And when you talk about a multinational organization, one other factor which is always a bit overlooked is local vacations calendar. And I'm mentioning it because it did really
very practical thing, yes.
Yeah, like, you're definitely convinced you're going to get results next week. And when you call that guy, well, it's a bank holiday here. We don't work today and tomorrow. We're coming back the day after. So, it's not always that simple.
Yeah, I think the whole planning dimension. Yeah, please, sorry.
Oh, yeah. So I have a great example, which I encountered a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. So it was someone who is wanted to do this type of process mining analysis. And within the organization, there are two kind of departments which work separately. They have their own systems, and there's kind of a Chinese wall in between. And the goal of that particular project was to look at the end-to-end processes between these two departments. But of course, they had no way in order to bring that data together, because there was nothing there yet in order to be able to do that. And so kind of the process mining exercise becomes this thing where you are doing this for the first time, which is, of course, a really big thing. Try to bring these two data sets together with all the security risk officer type of things that need to happen, which really needs to have support of this senior management part to be able to push through and to be able to do it. And so in this way, so different type of projects can entail different type of challenges, right? So that's also what you mentioned. So it's not only the business value that needs to be considered, but also the big challenges regarding to bringing data together, or may have the discussion about how to go about the data security, or bringing data together and being able to anonymize it in a particular way, and how it should be anonymized to be able to analyze this. So there could be new challenges ahead if you are doing new things. Yeah.
Indeed, but I think people should approach this optimistically, because no matter how challenging it sounds, it may bring more value than what you put in. I'll give you another example. I mentioned the P2P exercise last year. Imagine we would have spent, and now I'm giving you a figure which is not necessarily real, I don't know, 300,000 on that particular exercise. Might seem a lot of money, but by identifying those vendors that give us problems with those orders, and by replacing them with the proper ones and smoothing the whole thing, the company gained like $1 million. So then, when you put the things in perspective, 300,000 doesn't really seem that much expensive anymore.
Yeah. That's exactly the cost benefit.
A lot of people get scared about the costs they hear. I'm not talking about your product in particular or any other product now. Like any new technology, it's expensive because experts are not that easy to reach. So you might even need to consider bringing on board some knowledge from an external company that actually does this, that offers consultancy. And consultancy doesn't come cheap, as we all know. So that might raise the cost of your process mining project. But then look at what you get from that. And if the proper answers are given to the senior management and you make a compelling business case and you can actually show the fact that, okay, I need this investment, but in 2 years I would get this from it. I'll give you another example here. Like, think about a smart cockpit that runs certain parts of your business. Like, if after the process mining exercise, it detects a certain thing happening, it can already trigger, I don't know, maybe a robot that does a corrective action or perform some specific actions to reduce a potential risk of, I don't know, incompliance, for instance. We have a lot of controls in finance. Yeah, so SOX controls or any other type of controls, it's kind of not visible until you have a breach. And then the cost of that breach might be huge. So you shouldn't necessarily consider the business case only as tangible benefits, but also the cost of not covering the risk of having a breach in your controls.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's definitely one part of the kind of things you can consider when you make the business case. Yeah, that you also take risks into account. I want to maybe make one more point, because before we were talking about like where do you position process mining when you're coming from this top-down, more strategic kind of view. You have to decide, right? And so really, right, what we see with organizations is also that they have different kind of internal structures. So there are different models that can work, and it's not just Bogdan, you were emphasizing kind of the divide between IT and business. That's certainly true, but I think there's a bigger spectrum from what we see depending on how the organization is structured. For example, again, it comes back to the use case, right? So it's clear, for example, if it's used for auditing, maybe, it's positioned as one of the tools in the audit department, so then the responsibility lies there. But even if you're going to use it for process improvement purposes, there's different places where it can be, because maybe the organization has a process excellence team, a process improvement team, and maybe there's a data science team as well, where maybe there's a lot of data scientists who are very good with data and, statistical tools and things like that. Whereas the process improvement people or the process improvement team, they're kind of the change management experts who are trained in Lean and Lean Six Sigma and who know how to actually make change happen in the organization, who support change projects throughout the organization with the different departments. So in that situation, usually also here you can, place the responsibility anywhere, but usually my recommendation would be to place it with the process improvement team, because like we discussed before, it's not just the domain knowledge that you need, someone who knows the process, but because translating those process mining insights into actual changes that can be tied to business value and to then actually execute the change to get that value for the organization, that's what these people are really good at. So that's maybe one last point I wanted to make here as well.
Yeah, and maybe one last point from my side as well. If there is in the organization something similar to a controlling group, so audit would come practically later on, but controlling should be there all the time. Try to use their force on your side. So bring them on board the stakeholders table and try to see their views as well. You might discover certain interesting aspects that people might not even be aware of. Like, for instance, processes that have controls applied to it. You might want to change a branch that definitely impacts the control definition. Or controlling team might say, but how about we automate this control by doing things differently? So discussions may quickly evolve from, okay, here's a picture, let's have a look, what can we improve, to having a round table, everybody looking at the same picture and then contributing with, but this impacts me, how about we do it differently? I think it's a project that shouldn't be run in isolation. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Rudi, do you also have a last point as well?
Yeah. So I think it's also something that evolves, right? So we get sometimes the question, is process mining kind of something that needs to be done on a central level, or something that needs to be done on the departmental level, or central or local, for example? And it also depends a little bit on, of course, how the organization is organized. So if the organization is available in different countries, for example, and organizing the process changes also in the different countries, then this local deployment would probably work best. While if they have kind of a central department where they are doing these bigger cost saving or improvement projects, and then of course you need to deploy it more on the central level. But this is also something that evolves. And so what I have seen in practice is that it can start at one place. So one person who is just enthusiastic about process mining, and then is applying this on a process or a project which was already kind of on the roadmap to do the analysis, and then take process mining along, and then started to apply this in their team. And then eventually it shows other people, and then it meets, for example, the auditing department, and they would say, oh yeah, maybe that's something that's interesting for us. And then they started to apply this, and then they have an audit, and then go back to the operations and say, yeah, we here see a breach in segregation of duties, you should check it. And then they would say, oh, how did you measure it? Then they explain it, and then they start applying process mining themselves to fix the problem before it becomes apparent. So in this way, it can go through the organization kind of as a skill that needs to be developed by each individual that has his own perspective of the process. And it's kind of the year-old BPM or process problem, right? So we have this process that's being used for a lot of different type of things. And that's the perspective you take on the process, or the skill you have, and how you want to use this tool or technique. And so I really see it as a tool and a skill that needs to be developed, and how it gets value, it depends on which hands process mining is. In an auditor, it brings different things than if it's in a process improver or in the data scientist, and data scientists would use it completely different way.
Right.
And so,
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way to close this session for today. Which, so maybe with those last words, for all of you to think about your own use cases, and try to tie the business value to these use cases for your own evaluations, and also when setting up your initiatives. I hope there were some tips and tidbits here in this discussion that can help you set this up successfully for your own process mining operations. So thanks a lot for watching, for joining, everyone out there. Thanks a lot, Rudi, for joining, and thanks so much, Bogdan, for being here with us today for this discussion. I really enjoyed it a lot. So please please let us know if you have any questions, or maybe topics for future sessions, or follow-up questions. You can approach Bogdan directly, Rudi and myself anytime. And that's great. And we'll see each other again in October. We will have a new Process Mining Café, which is about privacy, security, and ethics. So working with data, and what kind of things you should pay attention to in that regard. And we hope we see you back again then. Thanks again for joining today. Thanks, Rudi. Thanks, Bogdan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Hope to see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.